My name is Mervin Wright, Jr., and I am a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, Northern Paiute. I'm currently the Environmental Manager for the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, working in the Environmental Department within the Natural Resources Department. I'm also currently serving on the Tribal Council as a council member. I grew up here on the Pyramid Lake Indian Reservation. We moved, I was born in 1964. We moved here in 1966. My current residence is where I grew up my whole life. Graduated from high school, Pyramid Lake High School, went off to college, graduated with my undergrad degree from Cal State Chico. I came to work for the Pyramid Lake Tribe in 1991. I was a water resources manager or water resource director for 6-7 years. And then after I became vice chairman in 94, I became tribal chairman in 97. I went back to grad school in 1999. I got my master's degree in 2006 from UNR. And then I worked in the environmental department. I was a GIS specialist. So I worked a lot with our land out here, land management. And then I got elected tribal chairman in 2006. And then there was a recall, got elected again in 2007. And I served until 2011, I believe. And then I was a vice chairman for 2 years. And then I think in 2012 I lost my bid for re-election, and so I started just going to work with what I'm doing now, just natural resources management. You know, my father was a tribal chairman in 1969. I think he was elected to council, and then in 71 he was a chairman. They were responsible for bringing Senator Ed Kennedy and John Tunney out here to begin these water right negotiations and the whole plight of what we were trying to do here. They were responsible for establishing our Pyramid Lake fishery program back in the early 70s. They were also responsible, my dad, Mervin Wright Sr. and Bud Vidovich, Mel Tom and some of these others, Warren Toby, these guys. I always remember the times that they've spent. They talked a lot about these water issues, and I think when I got involved, when I decided to get my master's degree, it was partly because of the negotiations and sitting around the table. Nobody would acknowledge me, not even as a tribal chairman. I was an elected official in their eyes, and so all they needed from me was a signature. And so today, when I get involved with a lot of these water issues, it's not about trying to go in and start kicking people in the shins or, hey, look at me or listen to me. It's about, you know, trying to use good reasoning and logic with what it is that you have to say and how you have to say it, you know, because if people think that just because I'm wearing a suit and tie is what's going to get people's attention, versus, you know, coming in with a t-shirt and tennis shoes and just right off the street, you know, how are people going to treat you, you know? And so I know it says a lot. I know that whenever I go to Washington, D.C., I don't go without a supply of ties and a suit because it does make a difference. But when it really comes down to it, this is where we're from. You know, this is what we're made of right here. This is our origin. And so a lot of times when people, and I sat across the table from President Obama in 2010, you know, sitting in the White House, and sometimes people can forget that, you know, we come from the ground, and our ceremonies, the fireplaces, you know, the water, the ground, our Mother Earth, all of these things are all connected to us. And it's like they say, you could take the Indian from the reservation, but you're not going to take the reservation from the Indian, you know, and that's our home, that's our life, that's our family, you know, that's what you can't take from us. I showed you guys the watermarks, and you can see them, the higher watermarks along the mountainside. That's when the ancient Lake Lahontan was at that level, at its highest level, and that's about 10,000 years ago. And you know, the waters receded over time, and about 8,000 years ago, the water was pretty low to the point where, as I did my geomorphology study, there was a major earthquake that occurred about that time, and it shifted the ground in the Wadsworth area, which at that time turned the Truckee River north. Originally, the Truckee River did flow out into the Carson Sink, as did the Walker, but during this time, when you had that major seismic event, everything changed, and so the water kept receding, and you know, our people long ago enjoyed the spawning runs. I mean, there was a lot of fish here, a lot of Lahontan cutthroat trout, you know, the trout species, as well as the ancient Kuyui fish. And to the east is Winnemucca Lake, and Winnemucca Lake is about 80 feet deep, and it was warmer, of course, and it was a better fishery habitat for the Kuyui fish, as well as the Lahontan cutthroat trout. And so our people survived on the spawning runs. We survived on harvesting pine nuts, you know, in the Pine Nut Hills. And every spring they would converge here at Pyramid Lake over here at Nixon, where the current town of Nixon is. And in 1859, the United States set aside this land for a reservation. However, they did not put up signs indicating that it was a reservation, so we had a number of non-Indian settlers settle on the best lands out here, and their argument was that we did not have congressional approval for this reservation, and we did not get an executive order until 1874. And so, but by then, folks weren't moving, and so backing up to 1860, there was a battle here that took place over here in Nixon, and there was about 10,000, they estimate about 10,000 Indian people here for the spawning run. And of course, when you read some of the history, they say they were here for war council. And so anyway, two young Paiute girls were kidnapped and held over at Williams Station over by current Silver Springs, Lahontan Reservoir area. And some of the young warriors went down there and rescued them and killed the settlers there at the Williams Station and started the war. And so we were able to hold off the soldiers in that first war, basically won, kind of wiped them out. And then when the Army came back 2 weeks later, we held them off at the south end over there by Black Mountain, in just a real narrow area there, which we refer to as a stronghold. That we held them there until all our people can get away up north. But the reservation stood as it did, and of course in 1902 the Reclamation Act authorized the construction of the Newlands Project, which caused the demise of the lake elevation, reduced by 80 feet. Really interesting, in 1938, when Winnemucca Lake dried up completely, the United States declared Winnemucca as a wildlife refuge, national wildlife refuge, and they allowed it to dry up. In the meantime, because of all the over diversions of the Truckee River, the Stillwater wetlands was able to sustain itself. When we look at the natural trend of what was occurring, Stillwater was the one that was supposed to dry up and Winnemucca was supposed to thrive. But because of that man-made decision, it just changed, it just had the opposite effect of the natural occurrence. And so when you look at what man can do, man-made decisions, that's the destruction we have in our hands. And so the lake dropped, the delta here formed, fish, it made it impossible for fish to get into the river to spawn naturally. And we still have those problems of water flows. I mean, we have the ability to put high flows as much as 1,500 CFS in the river during the spawning season. And so it's a high enough velocity that fish can get into the river. And of course with the litigation of the Ordich decree, I mean, there's just years and years, decades of litigation that has occurred. You could look back at the millions and millions of dollars that each side has paid their attorneys and consultants. And today the river system's still the same. The water supplies haven't increased, they haven't changed. It's still the same river system. And so, but we could have probably used that money in other places. So I think when the reservation was formed, and we had those number of settlers, we still have some lands held by non-Indians within the reservation. And we've acquired those properties through a land exchange operation, as well as a water right acquisition operation and function. We have done our best to try to increase our water supply through those water right acquisitions, and I think to date we've acquired about 11,000 acre feet of water. And so, the 300,000 to 400,000 acre feet of water that's needed to sustain the lake elevation, we're quite a distance away from that. But I think when you look at the Truckee Canal and you look at Derby Dam and the efficiency of that project, that's where we've applied most of our energy at how inefficient the system is. But it's the United States, it's their project. And I don't think the United States is just going to close the door on the first project that they authorized to be constructed in the country. It's not going to be that easy. And so for us here at Pyramid Lake, we have to accept that. And what it's going to take to shut the canal and disconnect the river systems to make it what it was prior to that, that's a question that I don't have an answer to, and it's a decision that can be made, but I'm sure it's a decision that will be litigated over and over and over. But I think for the meantime, I think the premise of what those Lahontan Valley farmers and the Truckee Carson Irrigation District board members stated, that all they would enjoy is their headgate entitlement, no more, no less. That's not much to ask, and I think anybody else that has an entitlement on the river system, that's a satisfying determination for anybody's water right claim. Well, water is life, and it's always been known through the traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation that we have to take care of our surroundings. We have to be responsible, to the extent that we can, to assure that our water, primarily our water, is going to be available. And it's been challenging to those of us who are responsible for the management of our water resources to understand the legality of how the courts reason through their rulings, and how judges are persuaded to view a perspective, a competing perspective of what's necessary, because the court system and the legal system in the country is just a big mess, and as we've said, the legality that surrounds natural resources management has ruined, any ability to have effective management. The reasoning from one attorney to another attorney in a dispute, can bring out so many ridiculous perspectives on why, a court should rule a certain way. And we have in the Truckee River, and of course, when you talk about the river systems across the country, from the Columbia to the Rio Grande to the Missouri to the Colorado, everybody that has a livelihood in those river systems will tell you that our river has been the most litigated in the country. And you'll hear that here on the Truckee as well. We have a long history of litigation, and understanding hydrology and knowing how the water cycle functions and connects what's underground to what's in the atmosphere. Those are like common perspectives that I think we all can agree on, but once you get into a court system, all of that goes away. And when you've got a river system that flows through bedrock, and those that flow through pluvial systems, you get a change in how those river systems function with the corridor that it flows through. And so when you've got groundwater connections to the surface water, those are clearly defined, and we had a recent ruling over here in what's called the Tracy segment on the Truckee River, where the state engineer has ruled that the groundwater and the surface water are disconnected. And when you look at the legal system of our state and how the revenues are earned by the state, property taxes are at the foundation of a lot of the revenues that are derived by the state. And so when you've got new development, you're going to get higher taxes, tax at a higher rate. And so with all the development going on up there in the USA Parkway, it would be proper for them to determine that there's a disconnection so that you can allow for the development to occur. And so now we have to prove that the two systems are connected, and it's not enough for the judges to believe us to say that they're connected. Instead, they have people arguing that they're not. And that's the problem that I see with a lot of our water systems across the country, is that when you're talking about water, and water is life, and how you cannot have life without water, no matter what. You take water away from any system, you're not going to have life. And so that's how important it is to us to know that we have to be responsible in taking care of this stuff. But in today's day and age, with the economy the way it is and the way livelihoods are reliant on money, we've got to pay bills, we've got to drive our vehicles, we've got to, without money, you're basically unable to do things. And so when you look at what it takes to take care of and manage the resource, a lot of times those dollars are very limited, if not absent from, tribal abilities to be effective with our management. Nevada v. U.S., 1983, Supreme Court. We lost that case, Pyramid Lake Tribe, we lost that. It started in 1973 with the original filing, Pyramid Lake v. Morton. Rogers B. Morton was the Secretary of Interior at the time. It goes back to the Reclamation Act of 1902. the construction of Derby Dam and the Newlands Reclamation Project, and how the Bureau of Indian Affairs failed to establish a fishery or an environmental water right claim in the Ordich Decree. The only water right that the tribe was adjudicated in the decree was for agriculture and nothing else, and it was only for about 32,000 acre-feet of water. And Pyramid Lake is 110,000 acres in size, and it evaporates anywhere from 3 to 4 feet a year, so it takes about 300,000 to 400,000 acre-feet of water just to sustain the lake level. But because of the decree, all the water rights in the river system were adjudicated and there's nothing left. And so we were adjudicated to 30,000 acre-feet, which is 10% of what we need. And of course, we have a use for that water, so it's not like that water is going to enter the reservation and reach Pyramid Lake, because we have a use for it. So in 1973, the tribe decided to attempt to establish a fishery claim in the Ordich Decree. So the intent was to reopen the Ordich Decree and establish that fishery claim in the decree. And so we felt that it was the Secretary of Interior's responsibility, trust responsibility, to do that on behalf of the threatened and endangered fish species here at Pyramid Lake. And we went through the series of court cases and appeals, and it made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied our claim to reopen a decree. And so I just read that case again last year, and it's helpful to those that don't understand how the river system works to read that case and again understand how the court views the management of water rights and who has a right, and how property rights and property law plays into who has the right to divert. I mean, even like today, the Truckee River, we got about 70 CFS in the river at the Nixon gauge, but there's also water flowing through the canal to Lahontan. And when tribal members raise that question about stealing water and, hey, why are they diverting? It's because they have a right to divert. And I've always been an advocate to assuring that you take what is rightfully yours, no more, no less. And it was in recent negotiations with the Truckee Carson Irrigation District where that's what those farmers asked, and that's what those TCID Board of Directors asked for, was their entitlement, no more, no less. And we looked at them and said, well, that's all we want below Derby Dam, our right to our water rights, no more, no less. And so it's really about just taking what's rightfully yours and having the right to divert when you have that ability to do so. And so if you have a right to divert, then divert. You know, take the water that's entitled to you, and when it's our turn to use that water, then, you know, same attitude should apply toward us when we want to use our water. The Truckee River Water Rights Settlement, as I earlier said, is in effect at this time. In 1964, State of California, State of Nevada intended to establish a interstate allocation, basically divvying up the water that California has a right to, as well as the right of Nevada, use of the river. And of course, Lake Tahoe and all the reservoirs are in California, and they flow past the state line at Arid, and so the interstate allocation has always been at the forefront of a lot of the water right negotiations. And so in the 80s, in the early 80s, a lot of tribes, just like Pyramid Lake, we were litigating against the United States government, you know, to establish claims to water. And all the river systems in the West primarily were involved in litigation. It was President Ronald Reagan, whose administration was instructed by the president to begin negotiating with tribes. And in 1983, an Interior memorandum basically stated that they will reward the tribes who negotiate and they'll punish those that litigate. And that's actually in Daniel McCool's book, Iron Triangles. That's where, and I heard it when I first got hired by the tribe in 1991 from a gentleman from Yakima, Washington. He told me about that memo, and so I was searching and searching and found it. So the tribe, it was interesting because in 1985 the tribe had a referendum election here, and the question was whether we were going to negotiate or continue to litigate. And it was a split vote. It was a close vote. I was in college in '85, so I wasn't here at the time, but we have the records that show how the vote turned out, and it turned out to negotiate. And so the tribe began moving towards negotiation. And in 1976, Marble Bluff Dam was authorized for construction, as well as Stampede Reservoir. And in 1982, the tribe won its case stating that the Secretary of Interior had an obligation to use Stampede Reservoir for the recovery of the threatened and endangered species here at Pyramid Lake. In 1984, the Supreme Court denied the appeal by the Carson Story Water Subconservancy District. And so basically we won Stampede Reservoir in '84 for that purpose of recovering our fish species. In 1989, the tribe negotiated a preliminary settlement agreement with the Sierra Pacific Power Company at the time, and allowed space in Stampede Reservoir to be used by the power company. And it also allowed for a conversion of what they call fish credit water to municipal and industry, or M&I credit water, if it's not being used. And so I don't really particularly like that agreement, but that was a compromise. And I think when people talk about negotiation is compromise. So when we're encouraged by our tribal members at the council meetings to negotiate, you guys got to continue to negotiate. In some cases, no, we don't. We don't need to negotiate because there's really nothing to negotiate. When you put your interests on the table, you're trusting those on the other side that they're doing the same. And when your interests are meaningful, and you're willing to compromise those interests, I hear this term win-win so often, and I don't like that term because I think it's a cover. It's like curtain. You're pulling that curtain out. You're not really seeing what's actually happening. And so when people want to talk about compromise, you're actually losing. And so if you're going to compromise what you believe is a vested interest, and I'm willing to do the same on that equal level, then it's better to have a lose-lose circumstance of outcome, because then you know that the agreement is probably more truthful than anything, instead of calling it a win-win, because you're trying to not look at what you've given up, but you have to accept the fact that you've given something up. And so when we talk about the Truckee River Operating Agreement, and we look at this water rights settlement and how the river system is now going to function, it is going to become more dynamic, and it is going to have multi-use opportunities for so many more parties to be able to use the reservoir space. And so when the tribe is going to now schedule its water resources for the operation of the river system, we need to maximize the use of our water. We need to, people need to understand that it's not just the lake elevation that's important here, but it's also the water quality of the volume that's here, because as we've seen the Walker Lake get to a point now where it won't sustain no life, because it's a saline lake like Pyramid Lake, but the concentrations have gotten so high that no fish will survive. But so we're very interested in having the volumes of water reach Pyramid Lake. And so when we're talking about habitat, and part of our goal is to restore the Truckee River, the cold water fishery, which is to try to get our fish to spawn in the river naturally. We've got Marble Bluff Dam over here, which is a huge impediment. And we have the United States government, constantly coming in and trying to instruct us in what's best for what they think is proper for river management. And a lot of times it's about not upsetting folks upstream. And so when we have a right to this water supply, and we have an entitlement to use it and manage it the way that we believe is proper, then let us. I mean, that's what this whole settlement was about, was allowing everybody that opportunity to use their water to the maximum extent that they can benefit. And so that's all our intention is to do, is to use it to the maximum extent of the benefit. When I listen to some of the council meeting minutes, or listening to the discussion that happens at the council meeting, and people will go outside and go look at the river and see it's practically dry, and they talk about somebody stealing our water. We need to litigate against someone. We need to point the finger at Tumwa. We need to point the finger at the state of Nevada or Interior or somebody's, because our water's not in the river. And I sit there and I think about it, and it's like, well, shoot, Tahoe's below the rim. There's no water in the river to begin with from the headwaters. There is no water, When the drought is in effect, nobody has a supply, really. And I think what the Truckee River Operating Agreement is set to do is I think the one beneficiary that comes out of we call it TROA, the acronym for Truckee River Operating Agreement. The one beneficiary out of TROA that's going to occur is M&I use, because in a drought, well, there's a couple definitions of drought. There's a drought situation and a drought condition. And the artificial definition is drought situation. And so when you're looking at a drought condition, when reservoirs are all empty and Tahoe's below the rim, and there's an amount of water that's in Stampede Reservoir, the water purveyor, Truckee Meadows Water Authority, they'll have an opportunity to have that water available for community use. And so that's in a drought situation. A drought condition. Under drought conditions, that's how that would work. Under a drought situation, that's where the M&I supply cannot be met. And so because of their water supplies, it will trigger a number of management decisions to provide water for M&I use. We haven't got to that point where, through the TROA negotiations in the 90s, they would talk about the worst of the worst of the worst case scenario when it comes to drought. And, one thing about hydrology, and the mathematic formulation of analyzing your data, you can analyze your 100+ years of data, and you can use your best judgment to guess on what you think is going to happen, looking at all these particular occurrences equal to this day. But you still don't know what's going to happen. And so I don't want to say you're rolling the dice, but you want to have enough comfort in your analysis that that when you fall back on your management decision of what you want to do with your water, just like we did this year, our concern is the summer months. our concern is July, August, September, and again, our cold water fishery. Trying to have some fish available in the river beside carp, you know, and to look at the vegetation and you look at the canopy that has been created because of the low water flows. That's a good thing, because with shading of the river we get cooler temperatures, and when you've got cooler temperatures in the river system, water quality improves. And so those are things that you know, we look at to try to benefit from, you know, even with the low water flows, is that it is having a positive effect with respect to the habitat, you know, the river habitat. So I think when you look at climate change and what has happened by reducing the water available, the decisions to utilize your water resource, you know, that's the decision you have to make. And so if we've got, let's say, for example, 50,000 acre-feet of water in storage in Stampede Reservoir, for example, and you've got a minimum pool that you've got to leave in the reservoir, are we going to, you know, draw it all the way down to where it's going to be zero water availability? Or are we going to say, okay, we're going to have to hold that for next year, or the next year, or the next year, depending on, you know, what Mother Nature provides in the winter. Those are decisions that we make, and we decided this year to maximize the use of our water, you know, because of, one, water quality, and two, we have a river system down here that I remember the tribe in 1998, we received the what's called the unappropriated water. It's the water that's available in floods, and so in high water events, like I told you before, during a normal water year, all the water rights would be served under the decree. But in a wet water year, you got water above that, and so nobody made a claim to that, and so the tribe was awarded its unappropriated water claim in 1988. And I remember during the TROA negotiations, the power company was alleging that we were going to fill up all the reservoirs and not allow anybody any space to store their water. And it was so easy to respond to that, because it's like, we've got demands in the lower river, we've got a need in the lower river, why would we leave it in the reservoir? You know, it makes no sense to anybody that knows that, you know, the lower river system in Pyramid Lake will benefit by having that water flow to it, you know, instead of leaving it in the reservoir. I mean, but see, that's how people think, you know. I mean, it's almost like this greed mentality that they try to apply to us. It's like, no, you know, if you've got a need for it in your lower river, you know, it's better for the fish to have it than it is to leave it in storage, just so that somebody can enjoy launching their boat or you know, going out there and enjoying the reservoir. You know, that's not our intention, and it's not our intention to upset people or insult people. But you know, when you've got a story to tell, or you've got a claim to assert, that's what happens. Water quality management has been one of our priorities that been assigned, you know, coming on to work for the tribe. Fortunately for me, water quality was one of the principal focuses in my graduate work when I got my master's degree at UNR, working on our water quality standards that we had recently established to determine how this water rights settlement that's currently in effect would play a role in helping the tribe achieve those water quality standards, and looking at the volumes and timings of the flows in the river to try our best to manage our water resource availability to achieve those water quality standards. And right now we conduct monthly sampling of the Truckee River, and we also do monthly samples here at Pyramid Lake to analyze the quality of the water, the constituents that we monitor, just to assure that we're trying to meet the baseline standards of acceptance. So water quality is one of those issues that we've been working on. Another issue that we've worked on is our range management. We have a number of cattle operators out here on the reservation, and we have approximately 390,000 acres of grazing units around the reservation here. And we've been conducting what they call an inventory assessment on the vegetation available for our cattle, our livestock, along with the natural wildlife. And of course, we've had problems with wild horses, and the number of wild horses that roam on and off the reservation also impact the vegetation that's available for our livestock. So we also been evaluating the springs and the different wells, the water levels in this mountain range here. For example, we have the grazing option that we work with the Bureau of Land Management on, and they basically closed this one here. They call it the Para grazing option. They've closed it because the springs have dried up. This has been for 2 years now, and so the drought has had that effect on the water availability. And we have a number of springs back on that mountain range there, up on the east side, as well as back over here on the west side of the lake. We've got a number of wells and springs that the cattle use, and so we been working on trying to assess the effect of the drought that it's had on our range. I'm currently working on a noxious weeds grant application because we've got a number of non-native invasive plants that have inundated the river corridor that were a result of, of course, the settlements and people coming into the west, bringing these plants into the area, and now they've gotten to a point where they outcompete the native vegetation. So we try to do our best to restore the native vegetation and control the infestation of those noxious weeds. I think a water supply, a constant water supply, consistent water supply from year to year would be the ideal situation to maximize the use of the Truckee River Operating Agreement Management Scheme, the way it's intended to reset the natural flow system. The hydrograph that you see, the natural occurrence hydrograph that happens with a runoff system, that it would be good to see that occur to from one year to the next, that we would have a consistent water supply, that if there's a possibility to sustain the lake level or even see it rise to the point where it spills over into Winnemucca, that would be great. I think with all good reason and logic, we can't get too far out of context of what we can expect to happen versus what we can dream to happen. And what's real is sometimes not always favorable, but as long as we can accept what we're capable of accomplishing, I think that would be good enough.